In this episode, I sit down with Intrepid, a photographer, engineer, sailor. For the last 4 years, he hasn't just been observing the world, he's been sailing through it. Literally living at sea with his wife and 3 children completely off grid, surviving the pandemic on a sailboat while stateless and locked out of his own country. What makes Intrepid unique isn't just what he's done, it's how he thinks. He spent 25 years photographing over 60 countries, built renewable energy startups as a chemical engineer, and then engineered a life of radical freedom, generating his own power, water, and food while navigating global lockdowns from the middle of the ocean. In this conversation, we talk about the fragility of modern systems, what true independence actually looks like, how photography and engineering guided his worldview, and why provenance and sovereignty are the foundation of everything from family to art to blockchain. This is a conversation about freedom, resilience, and building a life outside the control of centralized systems. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Intrepid. So you've been living on what, a boat for how long?
So we spent close to 4 years sailing. So 2 years during the pandemic. We got stranded in the pandemic. That's a whole nother story. And then we came back to Australia for 2 years and then went back to the boat these past 2 years and did about 10,000 miles sailing up the US East Coast and back down to the Caribbean. So that was quite the story.
Yeah, I bet. And what inspired this whole origins of, sailing around the world or living on the boat?
So I guess, my history as a photographer goes back about 25 years, and we've done a lot of travel over that time, maybe, shot in 50, 60 countries. And when we had kids, we were living in Canada. So we spent 3 years in northern Canada shooting a series there. And we had a truck camper, and, we're traveling around the north of British Columbia and Alberta. Um, and we had our third child in Canada, so she's actually a little Canadian because she was born there. And we just thought to ourselves, my wife and I, were like, how can we keep this lifestyle in terms of how can I keep working like this? And if you look at a lot of adventure photographers, often the photographer is away from their family for 6 months a year off on assignment.
Yeah.
So I'd really just, I didn't want to do that to my family. So the logical solution to that problem was basically to have a house that you can move from country to country. So a sailboat made sense. And so when, we had been in Canada, as I mentioned, and very cold up there, North Canada was like minus 35 C, which is about the same in F. And we were looking to move somewhere warm. And so we bought a sailboat, 40-foot catamaran in the Caribbean. We actually bought it in Martinique about 10 weeks before the pandemic. So we moved down there, moved the family onto the boat, and sailed around for about 3 months, and then got locked down in St. Martin initially. So 90 days locked down on the boat. The kids couldn't get off the boat. For over 3 months. That was pretty brutal, really. And by then, when we came out of that, Australia had locked its citizens out. So that's kind of how we ended up being stranded in the pandemic. We were essentially stateless because Australia wouldn't take us, and no other country would take us for a while until Grenada, little country of 130,000 people, saved us. They let 1,200 stranded yachts in, and then we proceeded to spend the next couple of years just doing laps of the Caribbean, waiting for a chance to get back to Australia.
Where in Grenada did you end up staying?
So we after the 3 months in St. Martin lockdown, essentially we applied for this program to be let into Grenada. And we were allocated a certain date, so we had to kind of leave on a certain date, which is never a good thing sailing because the weather, normally you sail to the weather, not to a specific time frame. So it was a 3 or 4 days sail down to Grenada, and we had terrible weather. We had frontal systems, water spouts, etc., going down there. And then initially we had to quarantine on the boat, so we hadn't been off the boat for almost 4 months at this stage, but we had to do then another 2 weeks quarantine on the boat when we arrived. And then so I mean, on a boat, basically, you can you still have some freedom of movement once you're within the territorial waters. So in Grenada, we ended up spending 6 months there, and basically everywhere in Grenada. Grenada owns the southern part of the Grenadines, so we spend a lot of time up in Carriacou and the islands around Carriacou, and yeah, most of the little anchorages in the southern and the western side of Grenada.
Yeah, I've been to St. George. It's a beautiful area.
Yeah, it is a beautiful country, and I'll forever be grateful to the people there because it's quite a sobering thing. You're from Australia's a top 10 or top 15 GDP country in the OECD, a similar GDP to Russia almost, and you think, okay, let's Australia's going to do something. It's going to fly citizens home. It's going to repatriate people, but basically, Australia just shut us out. And when your own rich country is just shutting you out, and these little poor countries are offering a hand, I mean, it shows you, I guess, the priority of humanity for people.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And then living on the boat, how did you guys get, resources, food, all that?
Yeah, so when we were on the boat, just before the lockdown happened in St. Martin, it was kind of obvious what was going on for the about 3 or 4 days. Well, we still had freedom of movement. So my main concern at the time was fuel. We had dependencies on fuel for running generators to generate electricity to make water, for example. We have a little desalinator on the boat. And so just prior to the lockdown, I went and bought like a whole bunch of solar panels. I'm like, okay, if we're going to be stuck on this boat, we need to be completely self-sufficient. So, we had essentially a little escape pod. We had, solar and wind turbine linked to a off-grid power system. We made our own water through a desalinator. Um, we could catch fish. So once we were set up, we were pretty self-sufficient. We could provision for 3 or 4 months at a time in terms of dry goods and tins of tuna and things like that. So what we would do, because there's obviously a lot of restrictions everywhere we went, was basically just keep to ourselves and end up spending the most part of the 2 years at pretty remote islands away from society, and yeah, basically just living in an alternate reality while we watched the world work through the pandemic. So in some ways it was a very isolating time. In other ways, it was a beautiful way to spend a couple of years. It forced us to spend a lot of time with our kids. I couldn't really work. Obviously, I could shoot photography, but I couldn't really engage in society in any meaningful way to work. So, we would just hang out at the beach with the family and go to remote places, try and stay away. We had, the complications of the pandemic for us being stranded as well. That it kind of went beyond just not being able to go home. We had a series of, I guess, forgotten citizen issues in the sense that the Australian government declared a travel ban, what they call a Class 4 do not travel restriction on the whole world, which voided our travel insurance. So we lost our travel insurance, we lost our health insurance, and we then had issues with things like passports expiring. So my son's passport expired. We couldn't get a new passport because we couldn't travel to an embassy to sit in the interview. So we had to do a Zoom call, and then they FedEx some essentially refugee papers that say these papers are valid for travel back to Australia. So we ended up with a lot of issues like that. We then had banking issues. We had all of our Canadian banks close on us. That basically issue a statement saying we're shutting your bank account down due to fraudulent activity in the Caribbean. And when we called them up, they're like, okay, you need to come into an office at TD Bank and verify with your passport that you're the person who owns the bank account. And of course, we couldn't travel to Canada to go to a TD branch. So we basically lost all access to our money. So it was quite an interesting time. And I guess it made you realize how fragile all of these systems are that we take for granted. You kind of assume you'll be able to get the money out from your bank account. You assume that you'll be able to travel and you'll be able to get a passport. You assume that your country will let you home. And so, yeah, we just became, we kind of entered a self-resilient mode where we just essentially kept to ourselves, made sure we had enough long-term food supplies, and yeah, just hung out by ourselves. I mean, we had in a lot of ways a blissful time. As I said, it forced me to spend a lot of time with my kids, with not a lot of other distractions in terms of work or the general distractions of life.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you had to go into full-time survival mode.
Yeah, in some extent, yes. I mean, in other ways, we didn't feel at the time like we were looking at what was going on in the world, and I know there's a lot of cities that went into lockdown, and I think in some ways being locked down in a major city, like Melbourne or in New York or somewhere, it would have been a lot tougher because you don't have a lot of outside space if you're stuck in a small apartment. We I guess had some geographical freedom even if we couldn't really interact with society.
And were you able to dock and get off the boat at any point, any of the islands that you were going to?
Yeah, for sure. So once we were in Australia, sorry, once we were in Grenada, um, we had freedom to go to shore. There were land restrictions in the sense that you couldn't just go to the shops, etc., without paperwork and masks and all of that kind of stuff. But um, certainly, we went to shore at most of the islands we went to. We then, after 6 months, managed to sneak into the Grenadines. St. Vincent has the Northern Grenadines, and they opened to stranded boats, and we entered in the first week as part of that program. And about, I think, 10 boats got in, and one of those 10 boats tested positive for COVID, so they shut the program down.
Wow.
But we basically got across, which meant that we were in the Grenadines, and no one was in the Grenadines. Like there were no flights, no cruise ships, no boats. Um, and so that was pretty amazing. It was like the 1960s in terms of there was just these places are just normally totally crowded with package tourists and
Yeah.
people flying in and all of the jazz that goes on in the Caribbean. And so, yeah, we were able to basically go to places like the Tobago Keys, which are normally there's 1,000 boats at Tobago Keys at Salt Whistle, and there was only our boat and one other boat who was a friend of ours. So yeah, it was pretty special to get in there, and then as different countries like the smaller independent countries started looking at, I guess, these 1,000 boats in Grenada, thinking, this is a little bit of potential revenue if we can get them into our country, because basically all the package tourists were shut, and that's most of their economy. So they started kind of just cracking the door open a little bit to stranded vessels, but of course everywhere you went there was multiple weeks of quarantine when you got there and testing, and quite a mission to change jurisdiction. But yeah, in the end we went to quite a lot of countries. I think like 12 countries during the pandemic. So
Wow.
while everyone else was
Yeah, I was about to say you're probably one of the very few people who was actually traveling during that time.
yeah. No, I mean, it's certainly like we had an amazing experience in the sense that if we did go to places, people would come out to the boat and say, "How did you get here?"
Yeah.
Everyone's livelihood was kind of being destroyed. I mean, I think these little countries, they have no other source of income other than tourism for the most part. I mean, Grenada make a little bit of coffee and a little bit of nutmeg, etc., but it's really just tourism. And when you shut the tourism down, they don't even have their own really sovereign currency. So they run the Eastern Caribbean dollar, but it's just fixed to the US dollar.
Mhm.
So they can't print money, um, and they have to raise money on the bond market if the government wants to spend money. And so during this time, they tried, St. Vincent tried to, and St. Lucia tried to raise money, and basically they couldn't sell the bonds. So it was kind of like extreme austerity as well for a lot of these governments, because no one would buy the bonds, because at this point people were like, we don't know how long this is going to go on for. Maybe this is the new normal. Maybe it goes on for 5 years, and then how is St. Lucia or St. Vincent ever going to pay back these bonds
Right.
if tourism never returns? So it's a very different situation compared to the States, where you could just put the quantitative easing on hardcore and just double the money supply during the pandemic. Um, these guys basically just had to tighten their belts and resort to island living. I mean, at least in the Eastern Caribbean, it's pretty lush. So, you could always get uh, avocados and coconuts and mangoes, and, those kind of tropical fruits are readily available.
Yeah, there's tons of
Uh,
food, but it's not exactly a very wealthy area. I remember being there. It's just, it's very poverty stricken.
yeah, and the other issue is that all the economies are integrated into these flights. So if you think about flying down They get, Grenada might get a million, couple million tourists a year.
Hmm.
Every one of those flights, they're backloading or they're, loading under the plane produce. So if you buy something online in Grenada, it comes down on one of those tourist flights. So it's kind of subsidized by all the tourism. They're running freight on the tourist flights. And so if you block all the flights and you block all the cruise ships, then you're blocking the whole logistics network to bring in things to the country. So it was very hard to get any kind of imported goods, which is basically everything.
Yeah.
And in terms of food supply as well, that was pretty impacted. So it really did revert to just whatever they could grow on island. And there were some advantages to that. For example, Grenada export a lot of yellowfin tuna to Japan as sushi, sashimi, and they couldn't fly the tuna out. They couldn't fly lobster out. So you could buy lobster and tuna for less than you could buy chicken because they had to fly in the chicken. So it was it was kind of an interesting economy, and it's back to island economy. And also, but there was not, because there were no tourists there. There was also a surplus of those things because they're you know catching enough tuna to send to Tokyo and Hong Kong and feed all the tourists. But now you're back to 100,000 people. It's the fishermen then are just at the docks trying to sell you tuna for $6 a pound, and it's yeah. So it was certainly an interesting time for the locals as well.
How old were your kids during all this?
So my daughter was 6 months old,
Okay.
so pretty young when we first moved on the boat.
Yeah, so
Um,
pretty bulletproof, didn't really experience much.
yeah, I mean, she's pretty oblivious to the whole thing. My
Yeah.
boys were 4 and 5, and they loved it. They looked back at it as the best time ever because they had the full, the full focus of both the parents, and just every day playing on the beach. So it's for them, I guess they weren't attached to any of the ongoing stress, and particularly the early time in Grenada, sorry, in St. Martin when we were in the lockdown. Very stressful because we didn't really know then at that point what was going to happen.
Mhm.
And we were in the EU. I mean, technically, we were on the French side of St. Martin. The French rounded up all the boats in the French Caribbean and brought them to this one anchorage in that part of the French Caribbean. Anyway, brought them to this one anchorage. But it was just after, if you recall, 2 years before the pandemic, there were two Cat 5 hurricanes that went through Puerto Rico. Both of those hurricanes had hit St. Martin hard, and so all the infrastructure was broken. The bridge into the lagoon was broken; it didn't lift. So we were kind of stuck on the outside of the island and couldn't get to the lagoon, which was potentially a bit safer in a hurricane. And there were all these boats that were washed up on the beach that hadn't been salvaged yet from the hurricane, the years before. And we're just sitting there looking at these boats thinking, okay, if we have to sit here for hurricane season, we're going to end up on the beach, which is not, really an option with your kids. So we provision, initially we were like, okay, they're French, they're pretty lax on laws. So we didn't get into the beach, and the French came down with, machine guns and yelling at us in megaphones in French. And so we, get back to the boat, and then they started fining people for swimming. They put a law saying you couldn't swim off your boat, which was ridiculous because on a boat you can't really make enough water from your desalinator for everyone to shower properly. So, we had to keep swimming. Essentially, we just have someone on, we call it gendarme watch because it's the gendarme nautique.
That's crazy, by the way. I mean, you're going to put COVID in the water and give it to the whales?
Yeah, it is crazy. I mean, they had, these Caribbean islands don't have very good sewage systems in terms of most of them, because there's a couple of knots current off the island. Most of them just pump the sewage out to sea and let it go, into the Caribbean Sea. And not normally an issue because it's offshore. And but what happened in the lagoon, they were worried about, they tested the lagoon and they could test COVID in the sewage. And so they put a ban on swimming for the people on the land. And then basically they said, oh, well, we know you guys have no risk out there, but we don't want the people on land seeing you swimming because they will then get angry that they can't swim, which seemed a bit ridiculous. But
Yeah.
I kind of had some sympathy for that. All the people, if they're in lockdown and they see these foreign boats out swimming and they're not allowed to swim. For us, it was more kind of an essential service to be able to swim.
Yeah, and I mean, you're stuck on, what, 50-foot boat? How big's your boat?
It's a 40-foot boat, so it's not huge, but it's a catamaran, so it's like the size of a small New York.
Yeah, and to be stuck on that, you should have access to water. That's insanity.
Yeah, and we were lucky. I mean, we had a water maker, um, so we could make our own, drinking water. But there were other boats that were reliant on going to shore to get water, and initially they blocked them going to shore to get water. And then a little water boat popped up that was then delivering water to these boats, and then that water boat got shut down by the French authorities. And then, of course, you need water or you're going to die pretty quickly. So it ended up that the police were then delivering water to various boats that couldn't make their own water. So the whole system, like we were such a minority edge case that, particularly in France, because France is very centralized compared to Australia or the US in terms of the way it's federated. And
Hmm.
so basically, they'd make one law for Paris, and that would then be applied to the whole empire. So you would have these crazy lockdown laws that were driven by the situation in the metropole in France, and essentially we would have to apply them on this little remote island. Um, and that made it pretty difficult.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. And then first off, where did the idea, I know you said that you wanted to travel because you were a photographer and you didn't want to leave your family behind, but earlier than that, did you grow up in a family that was into sailing? Was there anything previous to this? Because most people don't just jump into sailing, I'm gonna, travel the world by boat.
Yeah, no, I mean there wasn't. As I said, but I was just really a traveler. I've traveled since I started photography when I was a teenager in the late 90s, and so I'd just been traveling my whole life, and I was just like, how do I travel with my kids? And so I'm one of those people that just does things,
You just
and
started
so
doing research.
yeah, we looked at it, did some research, and then I did a month of intensive training with the RYA, the Royal Yacht Association,
Hmm.
um, basically up to day skipper level, just kind of crammed it in a month. And then we bought the boat, and I was like, okay, try not to kill the family. We're going to keep everyone alive. But we had initially planned to take it easy. Like Eastern Caribbean is an easy place to start sailing because the islands are so close together. So normally you can do an 8-hour sail between countries.
Yeah.
When we were at St. Martin, we had never done an overnight sail. This was part of what made it so stressful for us as well. Like we were provisioned basically to, I was allowed to go to land. If I wrote 2 pages out in French, um, I could go to land to provision for 1 hour. The skipper of the boat essentially could go for 1 hour. And so I just started provisioning. I would go in, and no one was allowed to drive around. They had quite a strict lockdown. So I just walked to the supermarket's called Super U, and it's a French chain, and I would just get a trolley and then just push the trolley down the center of the main road because there's no traffic, and then push it to the dock and just take the trolley to the dock, and then dinghy that food to the boat, and then the next day, do the 2 pages again, issue it to the police, and then walk down to the supermarket and push the trolley back. And so we did that and basically to provision up, because we thought if a hurricane comes, we're going to have to run to sea, which means basically leaving like the space. The worst place to be in a big storm is right next to an island, because you get blown into the island. So
Hmm.
if a big storm comes, you've got to basically go out to 10 miles offshore, 20 miles offshore, and then deal with the storm out there. And it sounds counterintuitive, but that's the safer place to be.
That sounds scary.
And the issue we have is that if we left the EU, because we didn't have basically rights to re-enter the EU. So if we had to leave, we may not have been allowed back into St. Martin. And at that current time, no other country was letting us in. So the Australian embassy was pretty hopeless. They basically said, "Oh, we can get you in. The only country we can get you into is the UK. So if you sail to London, we can get you in." And I was like, "Look, Australia's part of the war on terror. Can't you do a deal with the States and get us in, into Puerto Rico or somewhere?" And they're just like, "Nah." And at that point, crossing the Atlantic in the hurricane season with no crew, you couldn't fly. Crew, obviously, there's no flights. So
Hmm.
it was a death wish, but the embassy were just completely ignorant of sailing logistics. And we had never done an overnight sail, so we were looking, we were thinking, okay, maybe we sail 10 days down to Panama. Panama had shut, the country was shut, and the canal was shut to boats under 80 feet because they didn't want to risk the linesman getting COVID for not enough money. But the canal zone is an international water zone, so we're like, at least if we get to Panama, we can anchor in the international zone at the front of the canal, and then we're not at least out at sea. We're close enough to land that we can anchor without actually being in a country. So all of this is going through our heads. We had never overnight sailed. The first overnight sail we ever did was down to Grenada, kind of under duress with bad weather. I had, as it's interesting as a photographer, like we had this on the second night, we had this amazing frontal system come through sailing, and there was this beautiful front, and it had 3 water spouts coming off the shelf cloud. And I was like, wow, if I could just get a picture of that. But it's like, if I take the time to go get a picture of that, I'm probably going to flip my boat. So it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. But I have to just deal with it in my memory rather than as a photo. But yeah, you've seen Len. I mean, now after 4 years on the boat, we're quite proficient sailors now, obviously. So it's nothing like practical experience to.
What did you end up doing? Did you end up going to Panama or to the Atlantic?
No, we ended up basically, yeah, so Grenada and then open.
Okay, so you didn't go
We ended up just doing it, yeah.
Is when you're approaching, I mean, I'm assuming you guys have gone through some storms. Is it as scary as it is in the movies?
It is and it isn't. I mean, in terms of storms, it is. I mean, one thing with sailing is that if you spend enough time on a boat, you'll end up in, weather that you'd rather not be out in, just by sheer days of being out there.
I mean, is it like 6-foot waves and like everything you see just complete chaos? When I think of storms, I think of Forrest Gump.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little different in that these days you have better weather routing and better weather forecasting than you did perhaps 30 years ago. You just were like, okay, we're leaving, and you got what you got.
Okay.
Now you can run global weather models. They get updated every 4 hours. Particularly this last 2 years on the boat, we had Starlink, so we could actually even offshore rerun the modeling. But so we weren't ever in like big storms like hurricanes or anything like that. Obviously we're trying to keep away from that. We had one hurricane warning come over us while we were in Grenada, and we had to actually go to a little hurricane hole in the very south, and tie up into the mangroves. And that was pretty stressful.
That's scary.
Debate about, okay, well, do we, try and ride this out on the boat, tied to the mangroves? I mean, there are 3 little kids. If the boat flips in the mangroves, you don't really want to be worrying about this 8-month-old baby. So, we had a plan basically for my wife to leave the boat and take the kids. And but then you're in Grenada, which is not, as you can see by what happened in Carriacou just last year. The housing stock there is not really that great.
No, it's not safe either.
So land is not necessarily the best thing. And then of course there was already logistical issues with food supply, and so a hurricane would have compounded that, and then that often leads to riots and things in this.
Yeah, and the south side of Grenada, if anyone's ever been there, it's not exactly the safest. The north and south are kind of like the most dangerous parts of Grenada.
Yeah, so it's that wasn't pleasant. In terms of the types of storms we've had out to sea, it's typically more squall lines. You might go from pleasant sailing to 40 knots pretty quickly, and you've got to get we're in a catamaran, so catamarans are pretty for people that don't understand sailing, you have either a monohull, which is a single hull boat, just like a normal sailboat, and the catamaran has 2 hulls. On a monohull, if you get too much wind, it will kind of push the boat sideways, and the boat leans over. It's called heeling. And so you're spilling the wind. So if you have too much sail up, basically the boat will lean over more, and it can be dangerous in the sense that if you get an incredible gust, it can slap the boat down, and then some boats may not recover from that. On a catamaran, however, you don't get any tactile feedback in terms of that, because the boat is very stable on the 2 hulls, and then basically you hit a point where either the boat flips or the mast breaks. Both of which are not great outcomes. So you've really got to sail to numbers a little bit more on a catamaran. Like when you hit a certain wind speed, you've got to take a certain amount of sail down. And so basically, yeah, I mean, you're just scrambling to get sail down when things are going pear-shaped, and then just trying to ride out the storm, so to speak, while you're out there. But it's yeah, we didn't have we had some moments, but nothing that scared me from sailing. So
Yeah, was the plan always to live on the boat, or was it to kind of live sometimes, on land and boat?
the plan was to live on the boat. It's there's a lot of freedom living on a boat, um, and it's actually it's a very low cost way of living. I mean, there's a joke that sailors have. It's like the world's most expensive way to live for free. But once you have the sailboat, um, essentially anchoring is free pretty much everywhere. You're making your own water, you're making your own power, you can catch fish. It is a very low cost way compared to RVing or driving around in with a caravan. It's quite a low cost way of living, and then you can move country without just the power of the wind, etc. So it's it's a very liberating way of living it from that sense, in that you can basically just go wherever the wind takes you, pardon the pun, but it's like you have a you have this ultimate lateral freedom, and I didn't really realize it until I had spent years and years on a sailboat. That when I came back and I started driving around again, driving is very linear. If you want to cross a state, you typically have to take maybe one road or one highway, and you like driving. You have to drive the direction of the road, and that just seems a ridiculous statement. But when you're on a boat, you don't have any of that lineal constraint. You can actually go in any direction, and you can go anywhere essentially. So driving does feel kind of constrained. Um, if you drive past something, you see something off in the distance, you can't just sail over to it when you're on the road. You've got to, there has to be an access route to get to that where you want to go. So and then of course it funnels everyone through those same pathways, right? So you have these congestion points on the road, etc. So it is very liberating. And in the pandemic we basically just did laps of the Eastern Caribbean, because those countries were the friendliest. The small countries could be more flexible with their rules than the larger countries. The larger countries tended to have kind of large, um, generic legislation that they passed that was for the benefit of everyone, I guess, but to the detriment of lots of different minority groups who, the legislation wasn't really aimed at. But the smaller countries could be a little bit more flexible. So we just did laps of, smaller countries that let us in. And we didn't really feel like we had done what we had set out to do when we bought the boat. So that's why we kind of wanted to come back. And, when we came back, we had left the boat in Aruba, which is part of the ABCs, a little Dutch colony just off Venezuela. And so, when we came back, we sailed from basically Venezuela pretty much up to Canada. We went to northern Maine, so we were 15 miles off Venezuela, and we ended up about 20 miles off Canada, and then back down again to the Caribbean. So it was quite the journey. It was an excellent way to see the States too. Like, you don't realize how maritime the eastern part of the US is until you kind of see it via sea. I mean, all of those great cities were founded as colonies via sea. So we went obviously to Boston, and we spent almost a month in the New York area, and sailed under the Brooklyn Bridge. So we went through Hell's Gate and up the Hudson, and spent the night at the Statue of Liberty. We were the only boat anchored at the statue overnight, and
Wow.
it kind of did my head in because it's free to anchor um, at the Statue of Liberty, and you're just like, there's 10 million people in the background of this photo, and no one else thought it was a good idea to anchor for free at the Statue of Liberty. Shows you, I guess, the boxes that we're all in. People don't even think it's. When I tell that story to people, they're like, "What do you mean? It's free to anchor at the statue? It's like $200 a day to park in Manhattan." But it's there's old laws of the sea, basically trading laws, that you can come to a port and anchor for free because you kind of increase global trade in the 1700s. So it's still, yeah, basically huge cities. In Boston, we anchored for free just right in front of the city. We sailed all the way up. We sailed up to Delaware and through the C&D Canal down to Annapolis in the Chesapeake. and then sailed up the Potomac for 3.5 days. It's a long way up the Potomac up to Washington, D.C. We were there a week before the election, which was fascinating to see as well. You know, they're kind of militarizing the city and putting barricades all around the Capitol. Um, but yeah, again, you know, you can anchor for free up in Washington, just near the Jefferson Memorial, and a beautiful city to see by boat. And then came down the Chesapeake, and then from Virginia we cut down through the Great Dismal Swamp, which is a beautifully underrated part of America. Like, it's pretty exquisitely beautiful. The Great Dismal Swamp. Doesn't have a very good marketing name, the Great Dismal Swamp, but it's actually to see by a boat. And the army maintains all these canals at a depth to get military ships. It's kind of the Army Corps. It's actually, I guess, with the shutdown, it's one of the things that's being shut down. But they dredge all of these channels through the swamp in case they have to run ships inland. So it's amazing. You can get, you know, we spent over a month in, you know, between the swamps of kind of Virginia and North and South Carolina. And a great way to see these little towns. And, you know, if you arrive on your sailboat, you get a kind of different reception to if you've just driven in and park your RV out the back of the town. People, you know, asking where you're from and how you got there.
Yeah, it's almost like you're not necessarily participating in the world as much as you're viewing it, you're watching it, you're watching everybody else participate. Like how you said, you're parked at the Statue of Liberty, and there's 10 million people behind you participating in life, and you guys are just basically able to see everything from the outside. It's a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, and it's a very, you know, one thing that I love about sailing, and I've never been a package tour person. Like I've always done slow travel, like you know, 60 countries in a very slow way, and it's, you know, you kind of like you're moving at a pace where you can see how people live, and I think that's something to me. Like, you know, people do a lot of travel, and, you know, if you say I'm going to do a 2-week holiday here and I'm going to get these shots, or I'm going to do a quick trip to Patagonia and get some shots, and you just kind of like you're ducking in and you're getting out, and I kind of feel like when I did the work in Northern Canada, I spent 3 years there. I feel that it's kind of hard to convey the emotion of the location through the work unless you can kind of immerse yourself in the location. And I think sailing, you know, when people think, oh yeah, you know, Aruba, it's like you can fly down to Aruba in a couple of hours from anywhere in the States, and it's not very far. But like if you sail down there, it's, you know, you're moving. I say this to people, you're moving at the speed of a ride-on lawnmower. So it's like, you know, imagine you leave New York and you've got a ride-on lawnmower and you've got to take it all the way, you know, 10,000 nautical miles, which is about, you know, maybe 14,000 miles, land miles or something. But it's a long way at that speed. I mean, it's basically like a jogging speed, but because you're moving at a human speed, like you see every bit of water go past the bow of the boat. You know, the dolphins can catch up to the boat and jump out and have a look at you. And you're actually like, you can smell that part of the world. And it's, you know, it's things like smell you become like super sensitive to that when you're living at sea. And, you know, little things like the smell of land. Like I'd never really thought about the smell of land, but,
Yeah.
you know, explain it to people. Like, when you live on land and you drive to the beach, a few streets back from the beach, or, you know, 5 streets back from the beach, you start smelling the ocean.
Yeah.
You can smell that beautiful smell of the ocean, and it's kind of like, oh, that's the ocean smell. And it's the opposite when you live on the water. Like you go on a 4-day sail and you're offshore and you're sailing for 4 days, like a good 5 or 6 hours before you see the land, you'll smell the land. And it's the most beautiful smell. Like it's like a smell of home, you know, because I guess we're, you know, bipedal mammals that evolved on land. So it's like, you know, you smell that smell and you're like, oh wow, there's going to be food there. There's going to be all these things that come with land. And I'd never really thought about that until I lived so long on the ocean. But yeah, land has a very specific smell. Obviously, big cities like New York, you can smell them. You can smell the pollution, you know, 30, 40 miles offshore.
Yeah, I bet.
We're getting to the Northeast. I mean, it's the Northeast of the States. There's a lot of people in that, you know, that area between Philadelphia and New York and Boston, like that kind of triangle up there. There's, you know, I don't know how many millions, but there must be 20 or 30 million in that little quadrant. But yeah, you can definitely smell that when you come up to it. But it's yeah, it really is a human scale, and I think that's what makes it so special. And it's quite. I enjoy the offshore sailing in particular when you're on night shift, and um, our catamaran has twin helms that are on the stern, like on the transom, like each transom has a helm, like a steering wheel. And you're sitting when you're sailing, you're sitting like literally like a meter from the back of the boat with the waves kind of right behind you. And at night time it can be pitch black, and all you can see is the Milky Way, and catamarans kind of surf down the waves. But you can't see the wave, so the wave will like pick you up, pick the boat up, and then you surf the boat down the wave in the dark, and then you bottom out. And it's a very kind of meditative flow state place to be, and it just goes on and on and on for you might do a 100-hour sail to get somewhere. So it's do a lot of thinking, listen to a lot of podcasts, and it gives you a good reflection. And then when you arrive somewhere, you have a different perspective, I guess, than you would if you just had flown in and all the craziness of the airport.
Yeah, it just seems so much more peaceful. It's like when you're on a road trip, you have to avoid drivers. It's stressful. You don't know what's going to happen. And I feel like when you're ocean, the main thing you're going to have to worry about is maybe some mystical animal that's going to, come from the depths of the sea. But for the most part, you're pretty safe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're worried about other boats, obviously, hitting them in the dark. And
Yeah, how do
the
you,
main risk in the Atlantic these days is containers.
yeah, how do you avoid that, hitting other boats? I'm assuming there's radars and lights and things like that, but does it ever, has there ever been like a scare?
Yeah, I mean, you have there's a lot of modern tech these days.
Yeah.
And to some extent that helps. So there's a system called AAS. So any boat over 50 meters, which is about 150 feet, by law has to have this. They have to broadcast the GPS position at all times
Okay.
by the AAS. A lot of small boats have it as well, like we have it. So if you're, if in terms of like other sophisticated boats, you're going to see them. You're going to see a tanker on the AAS. We have radar as well. Like when we're sailing up in Maine, quite challenging and often a lot of fog all day.
Oh yeah, I
So you're
bet.
basically sailing by radar.
Yeah.
And then they have just millions and millions of lobster pots. It's amazing there's any lobster left. Well, every 20, every 60 feet there's a lobster pot in a grid that goes 10 miles offshore. It's pretty insane, really. The
Oh.
lobster pots. So that's kind of difficult when you're kind of more out in the so in the States, like everyone, we either have AAS, so you'd see them on the radar. But obviously, like when you're off Venezuela, there's just fishing boats, and no one has any technology, so you're just really blind and reliant on just visual watch. So when you're sailing, someone has to be on visual watch 24/7.
At night though?
Exhausting.
What do you do at night though?
So we just my wife and I just do 4-hour shifts, so basically 4 hours on, 4 hours off. So
Wow.
by about 4 days with 3 kids, it's kind of the art of sleep deprivation by the end of it.
I bet.
And yeah, containers. The North Atlantic has a container problem. There's a lot of container ships roll off Greenland and Iceland. Roll enough that they lose a lot of containers into the sea. I'm sure everyone's seen the videos on YouTube or TikTok where the containers are falling off the ship. But the containers, they kind of bob under the water when they're a bit like an iceberg. You can there's enough air in them that they float, but they're heavy enough that they're mostly under the water. That's the main risk, really, is hitting a container because you can't really see it and it doesn't show up on the radar.
And can that take your boat out?
It can, and I guess that's one of the advantages of a catamaran is that if you hit a container, hopefully you hit it just with one hole and you've still got the other hole intact.
Yeah.
But modern boat design, they have on our catamaran we have what's called crash bulkheads. So the front a few meters in the front 10 feet of the boat, not 10 feet, but maybe 6 or 7 feet of each bow is basically a crash bulkhead that has foam in it. So the old days, if you smash the front of your boat, the water would get in essentially. Whereas now they have these kind of disposable crash zones that at least you're going to lose a bit of air, hydrodynamics, but you're at least not going to sink.
Yeah. I've been meaning to ask, when you got into all this, were you just making your income primarily off of photography, or did you have a job?
Yeah, so I mean, I run two parallel careers. for the last 20 years. And so my wife and I have run startup engineering companies. So I used to run a engineering startup incubator doing renewable energy startups. And my wife and I are both chemical engineers. So we did that. Obviously, we have a higher than normal, risk profile. So, I was never one for, just working a job in a large corporation. It just drove me nuts. So, we ended up running this little incubator and did a lot of, so we would take technologies from universities. There was kind of a gap in the market in the sense that the universities used to do a lot of piloting in the 1970s and the 80s, and then the liability side of things shut all that down. So the universities shut down all of their pilot centers. Like they weren't really allowed to do any construction on any larger scale for fear of repercussions if there was an incident. So people would invent these things, and they might be a little tiny little desktop one, but there was no kind of, it's no bridging the gap from the desktop study to a commercial pilot that then would raise money. So yeah, we ran this little incubator, and we'd take ideas, we'd raise some money, and build maybe $1 million, a couple of $1 million pilots, and then once you had those pilot plants running, you would then raise money into like a spin-off company that then would then take that to a commercial scale. So yeah, we did that, and always kind of maintain the freedom. I don't think I've ever had more than a few months of runway for payroll in my life. We always maintain the freedom to geographical freedom and time freedom in that way. And so being able to travel a lot and work in different places. We lived in Switzerland for a while. Obviously lived in Canada for a while, and yeah, it's the world's a big place, and there's a lot of amazing things to see, and there's a lot of I've kind of got that engineering brain as well. There's a lot of amazing things to engineer as well. So I guess that's part of the reason that a boat was perhaps a little bit more natural to us, is that we were used to dealing with complex engineering systems, and the boat essentially is like it's like this engineering escape pod. You've got all of the power systems. In the end, we had a lithium system with inverters running off the solar and the wind. You've got a desalination plant there. You've got twin engines. You've got all of the sail motor prop systems. You've got all of the running rigging to run the boat, and obviously the sail dynamics and everything. So it's a complicated engineering system, a boat, and that's that part of my brain. That's one of the reasons I think you can kind of sail indefinitely, because that part of your brain is completely occupied all the time. Like people might say, well, isn't it get boring out there? But you're constantly fixing things and engineering things. So it is, I guess that's one of the, ship engineer is one of the original types of engineering, but there's a lot of systems to keep in, and then when you overlay on top of that all of the weather, you've got to understand the weather, quite, from a life or death almost situation. You've got to be able to interpret grid files of weather data, etc. And obviously also then all of the routing is quite complicated. So routing in terms of the way the wind's coming and how, what's the fastest way to get from A to B given a certain wind direction and sea state, etc. So, there's a lot of that kind of systems that you have to get your head around to sail. It's very different to driving.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's what we've always had that. I think any photographers, you probably interviewed a lot of photographers and met a lot over the years. Like, photography is a pretty hard gig, and
Yeah.
I grew up in the 80s, and back then my dad, we had a little dark room in the backyard, and we used to develop black and white photography in the dark room. It was like a little shed, 20 meters from the house in Australia, and Dad had this big wall of Nat Geos from the 70s, and I just fell in love with them. I would, it was pre-internet, so you'd just be coming from school and I'd read Nat Geo, and I just was dreaming of foreign places and being a photographer. Dad used to trade futures contracts on the stock exchange. So it was like so I kind of grew up doing photography and trading. And by the time I was 16, I had made some money on this. I used to trade um, 50 to 1 leverage ASX futures. So it's basically you put $50 in, and it was like you had put 50 times that in. Super high leverage, just small moves. And this is pre-electronic charting as well. So we had a pager, and the pager had the ticker, just like the numbers would just come on the pager. And so we would hand chart 15-minute charts, hand charting. So you'd watch the pager and chart by hand. I was like 12. And I used to love it. Like my engineering brain would just love it, just hand charting these 15-minute charts. And so I made a little bit of money doing that, not a lot, but enough that when I was 17, I was like, I'm going. And so I convinced my parents to get me a passport, and I bought some camera gear. I headed off to Indonesia when I was 17, and was there for a month. And then the currency crisis happened. So this was in '97, and I don't know if people remember the currency crisis. If they're younger than I am, they probably don't. But it was kind of in 1997. There was what was called the East Asian currency crisis, and it was a domino effect of all of these currencies collapsing. So, and I just kind of rode that wave. There's millions of people that had terrible hunger and starvation from it. But from my little bubble, it was one of the best things that happened to me, because I had just a couple of $1,000s, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go to Indonesia and make it last for as long as I can. And then when I got to Indonesia, the currency just collapsed, and each week it was like you doubled your money. And it kind of, in a lot of ways, it was a lead into getting into crypto and things like that, because I was just watching this whole currency devalue in real time. And there's early kind of internet in the late 90s, so there was I could get an email once a week from my parents, and it was pre kind of available internet cafes, but they were like you could get like a phone card and reverse call home and things like that. So I had kind of information of what was going on in Indonesia, but the people on the ground were quite ignorant to it. They were they didn't have any access to information, which seems crazy, but there wasn't a proliferation of TVs in Indonesia like there was in the West at that point. And by the end of it, I was actually doing some work as an extra in a movie. I played an American businessman in this movie in Jakarta, and I was on the movie set in Jakarta, and I was in this high-rise building, and there's a huge slum next to the high-rise building. And within a couple of days, and people kind of realized and started rioting in Jakarta, and I'm like, I've just got to get out of here. But before I got out, I went to this camera store in Jakarta, and everything, like the currency had devalued like 80%, and the camera store didn't realize they couldn't buy stock in for the prices that they had previously bought the stock in. So they hadn't adjusted their pricing. So I was just buying lenses at like 80% off. So I bought all this camera gear, and I was just feeling like a king, because I'd really started with such a small amount of money. I was only 17, and I was like, wow, this is the way to do it. I just need to travel. And then the riots got pretty bad in Jakarta, so I moved. Then I went to Singapore, and then got into Malaysia. And the same thing then happened to the ringgit. So it was just like wherever I went, the currency collapsed, and the ringgit, it was this contagion. The ringgit collapsed, and then things started getting bad in Malaysia. So I went to Thailand, and then the Thai baht collapsed.
Wow.
And so I was staying at it was like $1.50 for a room, and 10 cents for a beer. Which again, when you're 17, was just like, wow. So this little bit of money that I got trading futures contracts just turned into this, months and months and months of traveling. And I didn't have a lot of film. I was shooting. I had budgeted, 1 week of film, one roll of film a week. It's different. People can't comprehend that with digital cameras these days, but it's like I've got 36 shots a week essentially, so a few shots a day. And I think that training, okay, is this one of the 3 shots I've got today? Is this worth one of the 3 shots? Like, it's a different way. You really kind of premeditate your shots, and it hones your eye a lot more. And so then I came back from that, and I then started an engineering degree. But basically for 3 or 4 months a year, I would go traveling in the university break. So, I went to the Middle East for 3 or 4 months, and I spent a lot of time in New Zealand, just living in mountain huts and hiking. And went to Vietnam in '98. Vietnam had just opened from communism, so it was within 6 months of it opening. Went very different to what it is now. Went to Laos when it was still under communist restrictions. So every 300 kilometers, you had to get a permit from the police to travel the next.
Wow.
There was almost no tourists there then. This is kind of late '90s. What's interesting is that the Middle East now, people consider it quite dangerous. Um, and people think about Southeast Asia as like a playground, but back then, you had war in Cambodia. It was kind of off limits. Had the whole Pol Pot thing going on. The Middle East back then, pre 9/11, was quite safe. Southeast Asia was quite dangerous. So it's the geopolitics changes faster than you think, just in one lifetime, which is interesting. But yeah, so then I started doing. I sort of did the engineering degree and did a lot of travel, and I'm like, I'm going to be a photographer, and I started doing assignment work. And I did assignment work like in Nepal for trekking companies. I used to run a rock climbing club at the university, and so then got into shooting photos for trekking companies in Nepal. But back then you could get a down payment for say 1,200 slides, and I was shooting predominantly Kodachrome 64 and 3G Provia or Velvia, and you would get the down payment for the slides. They would pay for your travel. You would then go shoot for. We had one assignment we did. My wife and I went in 2004. We had two Sherpas for 5 weeks. Basically, they'd say, okay, we'll allocate you 2 Sherpas for 5 weeks, pay for all of your expenses, and just come back with some shots. But it's it's a different era. Like you spend 5 weeks up above 5,000 meters, and then you would come back, and then at that point, I had to send all the Kodachrome to Switzerland because there was nowhere to process Kodachrome in Australia. I kind of already starting to phase it out, and it would be 3 or 4 months before you got all the work back, and then you had to get them drum scanned, and then send it to the client. So I was kind of going down that path, and then of course the internet happened. I registered intrepidphotos.com in 2001, and the whole loss of provenance that we have. With respect to, we used to have provenance where you had the slide and you could give the slide to a magazine, and then they would take the provenance and actually physically take the slide. And then of course, by mid 2000s, it was obvious that all the magazines were going broke. That whole industry was collapsing. So then I kind of pivoted and focused on being an engineer. Because it was obvious I'd be poor my whole life if I was just a photographer.
It's really fascinating that you went originally into chemical engineering. What got you into that?
I guess just I guess I have a kind of very engineering brain, and it just seemed a logical thing to do. And growing up in Australia at that time, that was what people did. Is it's interesting now with all the AI and what role does the traditional education have in 20 years? That's a whole nother debate. But it's certainly back then in the late '90s, early 2000s, it was a pathway that made sense to develop skills that way, and it's been very handy my whole life. It's made it been a lot easier having been an engineer. But yeah, so it's it's one of those things that in terms of bringing it back to Web3 and NFTs, like I had that I lived through that phase where there was provenance and there was magazines, and I think a lot of people have seen the movie Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where there's like he's down in that little dungeon at Life magazine.
Yep.
With all the slides, and that was the provenance, right? Like when you sold a slide to a magazine, they actually took the slide, like it became a Nat Geo slide or a Life magazine slide or a Time magazine slide. But basically, the slide was the provenance. You could always prove you had the original because you had the slide. And that fell apart with digital, and if you don't have provenance, there's no value. And I think that became pretty obvious because there was all this value in this huge industry around that value, and then all of a sudden there was no value, so the industry collapsed. And it wasn't that people didn't want to consume that image or they didn't want to consume the information. It just that there was no provenance, so you couldn't monetize it, right? So it wasn't a lack of demand; it was a lack of provenance, and that's what collapsed the whole industry. And the internet is good at decentralizing things, but it really destroyed that industry. And then I got into crypto in 2017, and
How'd you find it?
I found crypto a different way to most. I wasn't looking financially at it, but I was deplatformed to a great extent on Instagram, and I had about 60,000 followers on Instagram, and would get 3 or 5,000 likes on a picture. And then I read in the newspaper that Meta was going to, I don't think they were called Meta then, but it was, Facebook was going to monetize medium tier influencers. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. How are they going to do that? And then within 2 weeks, my reach was down 80%, and I was getting like a little bubble that popped up that said, if you want to get more reach, promote your post for like $3 for 1,000 people, right? And I calculated it out, and it was going to cost me, I think it was like $70 a day just to get the reach back that I had 2 weeks earlier. And I was just like, wow. And it was kind of an epiphany for me. And I was like, I've just spent years and years developing up this business on Instagram, and I don't own any of those relationships with any of those people. You take it for granted that these are my followers, and it's like, well, they're not really followers. Like the followers you have on X, they're not. That's not a peer-to-peer relationship. It's actually a gate-kept relationship by the platform. And so the platform at any given time can just decide to cut that relationship. And so I went on a bit of a mind rampage looking at decentralized social media networks, and ended up stumbling across Steemit, which was it's like a proto network state that had developed by Darren Larimer from EOS fame. And basically, yeah, so I started blogging on this crypto social media network called Steemit in 2017, and I got suckered into buying a lot of crypto in 2017, and that all went down 95% in 2018. So that was pretty brutal. I mean, that crash in 2018 was just people. It was just much worse than the last cycle crash, but everything I touched went down 95%. It was just horrific. I mean, Ethereum went from $1,200 to $50.
Wow.
And so I was pretty scarred by that whole thing. But I kept blogging on the blockchain. Steemit eventually forked into Hive, which is a more of a community-focused version of it. And on Steemit, basically, or Hive, each of your blog posts is essentially a proto NFT. It's an on-chain NFT, but it's not transferable. So it's kind of a proto NFT. And then when NFTs started kind of evolving, ended up doing my first mints not till early 2021. I tried to get on Super Rare in 2020, and they were just anti-photography, and I just couldn't get on.
Yeah, I remember that.
And then Foundation started, and so then I basically used my Instagram clout to beg. The early system was an invite program, and someone had to sell something.
Yep.
To get an invite.
Uh-huh.
So I would watch every sale on Foundation, and then track their Instagram, and then I would DM them on Instagram begging for the invite.
Dude, I did the same thing.
And then early 2021, I got onto Foundation, and within 2 weeks, Vince had bought 2 of my works for 2 Ethereum each, and I was like, what? Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay.
And the rest is history, I guess. So I had a pretty good run in 2021. Launched Intrepid Falls, sold out 66 1-1s in a few weeks in that series, and I've been working at it for the last 4 years. I think I've sold now about 121 1s.
Wow.
Maybe close to 150 worth of volume.
That's amazing.
So, been kept at it. A lot of people dipped out in the bear, but I actually found the bear market to be one of the best things for the brand in terms of access to being able to get access to people that in 2021 it was like a mania. I mean, you lived through it. There's no way you could DM someone and get a response, or go and meet someone at an event and they would talk to you.
No, it was chaos.
Whereas 2 years ago it was so quiet that you could actually form relationships with the key people in the space, which was a real blessing, I think.
Yeah, I think that was the hardest part about 2021 was actually trying to have a relationship with anybody because things were coming at us so fast that you'd meet a new person every second and there was just no way to remember faces.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also people made with in terms of with their work in the mania, people were just dumping stuff into the market because
Yeah.
it was selling. And I think there were some collections that were put out there that people in hindsight probably regretted putting out. And on chain is forever, as they say. So, I mean, I was just lucky that I had 20 years of work to draw from.
Yeah.
So I could kind of curate a lot of quality over from decades and quite quickly. And I think that people, if you look at the 2021, Intrepid Falls came out. It came out a couple of days before Drifts, where my bands came out. And if you look at those 2021 sold out large collections, there's only really a handful that really succeeded. And most of them were like legacy work, because you can't really just come up with 50 shots or 100 shots that's all cohesive and all quality.
No, it's not easy.
If you've only been doing photography for 2 years, right? It's you kind of had to have that whole lifetime's worth of work that you could then put into a collection. That was kind of an advantage I had at the time.
There's a picture in here, Seven Sisters Top Falls. Is that from Grenada?
Let me have a look.
I'm looking through your falls collection. It's a beautiful collection, by the way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There are a few falls in there from Grenada.
Yeah, I'm looking at a few. I'm trying to find the ones from Grenada, and I'm going to go with it's Seven Sisters Top Falls. That's got to be from Grenada, just looking at the vegetation.
There's also a few in there from Dominica, which is another beautiful, underrated country. Every time I say Dominica to people, they think I'm talking about the Dominican Republic, but Dominica is between Martinique and Guadeloupe, and there's no airport there, so there's no international airport. So you've got to fly to another country and then either get a boat there or a little plane across. But yeah, Dominica's an amazing. There's 365 rivers. It gets about 7 meters of rain a year, which is 35 feet of rain. It's an incredibly wet place.
Yeah, it looks like a beautiful place. I'm looking at it. So the Seven Sisters Waterfalls, I've actually been there before. I know exactly where this is. This is an interesting hike to get to this. I don't know if you remember this hike. It the shit out of me.
Yeah, that's my little son there standing up proudly with his little stick too. It's
I love that.
So, and of course, all these places we would go there, and there'd be no one there, because there was no tourism. So it was again, I kind of like in some ways I'm loath to go back post COVID because it might just ruin the dream I have in my memory.
Well, I was going to say when I went to this location, we got chased by dudes with machetes. It was there was not it was not as peaceful as this photo. I mean, I got the photo, but yeah, at no point did I ever feel safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting area. It's a beautiful collection. I have, I've been shooting for a long time too, and I want to ask how do you go about curating these collections? Because I know it's not easy. Just I know finding a cohesive collection. Like, for example, did you just go through and say I've got 66 photos of waterfalls, so this will be a good collection, or was there something more to it?
Yeah, I mean, specifically for that collection, I mean, you have to have a look at the context of that kind of mania in 21. This was kind of August, September 21.
Yeah.
And, the Eye of Sauron had just looked at photography and, collections were just moving very quickly. And so I had just come back from the boat. I was actually in hotel quarantine. So when I got back to Australia after 2 years, they charged us $5,000 to quarantine for 2 weeks, which was friendly of them to do.
Oh.
And I was stuck in this hotel quarantine and we couldn't get out of the room. We had 2 beds for 5 people. And I'm just in the room watching, the NFTs because I was kind of living on these NFTs. Like, it became, when I was on the boat, I had all this time. So that's part of the reason I ended up in the NFTs. And then I was just like, what do I have? Because people were releasing these series that were like 50 to 100. And I was like, what do I have that I have that amount of depth and I can keep it cohesive?
Mm-hmm.
And I had just, for whatever reason, been obsessively chasing waterfalls for 20 years. And I'm like, the waterfalls has got the most depth in waterfalls. So that is what it ended up at.
I get it.
And, I guess more recently, like I have done the Intrepid ocean work. I've obviously been doing a lot of ocean work with 4 years in the ocean. So I've kind of wrapped that into a cohesive series, and I use the meta tags to break it into seasons. So season 1 was all in the Caribbean essentially, and season 2 is all in the States. And the work in Canada, the 3 years I spent shooting in Canada, I kind of pushed that all into the Northern Exposure series. So I have kind of this thematic series, and then I have work which is like I've got a series called Super Real, and the equivalent to that on Bitcoin inscriptions is Rare Earth. It's really the same series, between Ethereum and Bitcoin, but that work it's just more of my signature work from 20 years of photos. It takes a long time to realize what's a really special photo. And I think this is something that, having done it for 25 years, but like when you've got something, you think, wow, I only get a shot like that once every 5 years.
Yeah.
And so I've been to a lot of kind of, I don't like crowded places, so I end up in these more remote places.
Hmm.
And so the Rare Earth or the Super Real series is kind of like surreal landscapes that look like they could be fake, but they're actually real. And that's kind of what I'm going for in that signature series. So, that's kind of not necessarily like themed about the ocean or the north or anything. It's just more themed around the concept of that. But yeah, I'm not, I don't have a one specific genre with my photography. I got, I do have some cityscape stuff, and I do a lot of night photography. I spent a lot of time in Canada shooting the aurora, and actually ended up doing some work with the European Space Agency and NASA on Steve, which is like an aurora-like phenomenon. Published a paper in the top physics journal, which was a fun little side project. But
Does your wife shoot with you at all, or is it just you with the camera?
it's mostly just me with the camera, but she's kind of logistics on all these expeditions. So
That's awesome.
we travel as a family, so I didn't want to be that Chris Bookard 6 months away from the
Right.
family every year.
Well, what I like about your story is that, like most artists, when they want to live out their legacy, a lot of them will say, "Don't ever get a family. Don't ever have kids. It's going to hold you back. It's going to ruin your passion for your art, or your dedication." And it seems to me what you've done is you've created a partnership, and that you all work together towards this common goal of building this legacy. And I think there's something to be kind of learned from this, and there's something that's kind of beautiful about that, because it's very often that you'll hear, don't go down the family route, because that will end your entire passion for what you do. So yeah, it's a really cool thing to see.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it is a lot of work having a
Yeah,
family.
it is.
But it's like I don't know, like I'm pretty feeling very middle aged now. I'm in my mid-40s, and but kids keep you young. Like there's nothing like we've just I've just been learning how to wing foil with my son, and at 45, learning how to wing foil is like not the easiest thing. And but he's just so motivated. Like it's just every day, Dad, let's go wing foiling at the back of the boat. And it's just like you don't have that motivation. Like as you get older, like that just innate drive starts to wane, and slovenliness, becomes more of an appealing option. Maybe you think, okay, we can just sit here and do this, or sit here and watch this movie. But when you've got your 12-year-old just like at you every few hours, like, Dad, are we going windfalling? Are we going windfalling? Or let's go for a hike? Or, so I think kids keep you younger. And I think, there's obviously that initial period where it's hell and the kids are really young. And, that was one of the things that's so hard in the pandemic, because the junior was only 6 months old, and my wife was breastfeeding, obviously. Trying to do night shift, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. But her 4 hours off, like she wasn't getting any sleep. Like she was
Right.
just up with the infant. That period of really young kids is really difficult. And full respect to any young parents out there, but you get through that, and kids are such a joy. If you can foster a sense of adventure in them, like we have this innate sense of adventure. And I feel like, my kids, like they're just little adventurers. Like that's all they've done their whole life. We're back in Australia, and they're going to school, and they're just like, Dad, what's this? This is ridiculous. Like we sit here for 8 hours a day just doing nothing. Um,
I was just thinking, like,
and it's driving them nuts.
yeah, I was just thinking they've almost helped your photography in the sense because I don't know. I'm not sure. Would you have ever gotten on a sailboat if it wasn't for the idea of traveling with your family?
Yeah, look, probably not. I mean,
Right.
I really, my first love was the mountains. I mean, my wife might might not like that, but it's like my first true love is really the mountains. I used to love rock climbing. I was, my early 20s. I ran this rock climbing club as secretary of the rock climbing club, and I just sort of lived for rock climbing. I'd climb like 5 times a week.
Wow.
Outside. Ended up tearing my stomach apart, and had to get a mesh with a bad hernia, and had to get a mesh put in my stomach, and
Wait, how did this happen?
just climbing, overexertion.
Okay.
So, um, so I love that. I love the mountains, but I've come to love the ocean. Like the ocean is amazing, but it's certainly I don't think I would have ended up naturally at the ocean. I mean, I grew up. The funny thing is, I grew up next to some of the best surfing in the world, really,
Where'd you grow up?
on the east coast of Australia. And so, there's a lot of surfing. And then we moved to Switzerland because I wanted to do some ice climbing, and something you can't do in Australia.
Yeah.
And I was ice climbing with this waterfall climbing in the early 2000s with this guy in Switzerland. And then I was like, okay, well, in Switzerland, I'm going to learn snowboard. And so, we did this snowboarding, and I had this snowboarding instructor, and he was amazing. He's like, his life dream was to move to Australia and learn to surf. And it really struck me. I was like, you just want what you don't have. I'm like, here I was growing up near the beach, and had never surfed. Like I obviously body surf and
Yeah.
in the ocean. I've been swimming a lot, but I just had never connected with the surf culture in Australia. And so when I got back after living in Switzerland, I'm like, that's it. I'm going to learn how to surf. Bought a surfboard at like 2023, and I just went out every day for like a year with the grommets at the little kids after they came out of school, and just learned to surf. And it was more of a conscious decision. I wasn't just kind of because the surf was there. I didn't just naturally fall into it. So it is an interesting thing. But now I've spent so much time on the ocean. It's just got the ocean is a temptress. Like it just has so many moods.
Yeah.
And it's part of what makes the mountains beautiful is that, 1 minute it can be sunny and the next minute it's a snowstorm. And the ocean is kind of the same. Like it's just that perpetual change. The only constant is change when you're out on the ocean.
I noticed throughout the stories that you're telling me, you're obsessed with adventure. I mean, moving to Switzerland to ice climb, that's absolutely insane, by the way. Um, where do you think this came from? Were your parents adventurers? Did you go on hikes as a kid? This had to stem from something. The movie that you saw.
Yeah, look, I don't know. Like I grew up, it was almost an escapism. I think I grew up in suburbia. And it was kind of Australian suburbia in the 80s. It was very, very safe. There's no guns or anything in Australia. Like basically, we would just leave school and ride around on our BMX bikes, and we wouldn't come home till dark. And then ask where the food was, kind of thing. So it was, it was a very kind of blissful suburban upbringing, but it was also very boring. Like I look back at it, and it was just, I think I just wanted, as I said, we had this little bark room in the backyard, and I had all these Nat Geos. And I think I just lost myself in the Nat Geos, and I just wanted, I'm like, wow, this sounds just so much better than suburbia. And it was just, now even when we had kids, like we ended up buying about 40 acres on this remote little ridge, a couple of hours out of Sydney, because I'm just like, I can't do suburbia. Like, and anyway, I can never do it again. It just didn't click with me, even though it was perfect. Like that's the irony of it. Like people are like, well, what happened in suburbia that it just never clicked with me. It was just too, like everyone living in their little boxes. It just used to kind of drive me insane. Um, but yeah, it was a lovely, caring upbringing with very safe, a lot of freedom. I didn't have, and I think that's what I find the saddest part about the modern society is that freedom, even in suburbia, is kind of gone. Like parents don't let their kids ride around on their push bikes.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid. Every little incident now is broadcast on social media. So even though crime is actually less than what it was in the 80s, it feels like crime is 5 times worse. It feels like the subway in New York is 5 times worse than what it was in the 80s, but it's just statistically not. And I think, it's harder to put your kids onto the train, or it's harder to let your kids just ride around when you can see all this horrible stuff going on.
Yeah, we didn't
But
hear
the more,
about this as kids.
no, but the more time you spend out in the world, people are like, oh, people ask you about piracy on the boat and all these kind of things like that. People are just focused on all of that, right? Whereas the world is just such a beautiful place for the most part. 99.999% of people are lovely and have no intent of harm. So it's like, there's just such goodwill out there when you're out there. And then you come back to like these little suburban enclaves, and people are in these little bubbles of fear in a lot of ways. Like you don't want to go out after dark, you might get stabbed, or you don't want to do X or Y, or you don't want to. And I think that's one of the sadder parts of the internet. I think the internet has created a lot more fear because everything is broadcast. You have to worry about every little thing now, and previously you could just not have to worry about things you didn't know about.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a valuable lesson in that. That if you just kind of expose yourself, explore, and see the world, you're going to find that there's actually a lot more good than you realized.
Yeah, and it's just there's so much to see out there. I mean, the more you see, the more you realize how
Yeah.
little you've seen. And I think, um, that's what's great about the sailing is that like you can spend years just in one little archipelago. Like there's just so much to see. And I miss, what I really miss is travel where you see things that you've never seen before.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people will never get to experience that now. And I remember, like, I went to the Middle East in 2000. It was turn of the millennia, it was before 9/11. And I went to Jordan, and the first time I'd ever seen Petra was actually walking through the Slot Canyon and seeing it. I had never seen a picture of it, and that just does my head in now. Like because you see it on Instagram, you see it everywhere on cable TV or whatever. Like so, it's rare to actually go and see something that you haven't seen at least some kind of image of before. And I think it's a sad thing for humanity because like that joy of seeing something like a wonder of the world, like see the pyramids or something, and you really haven't seen many pictures of them, or, that joy is kind of being robbed from people. And one thing I like about the sailing is like we sail to these little remote islands, and because they're remote, no one, you don't know what's on the island. You just kind of anchor off the island, and then you dinghy into the beach and tie your dinghy up to a tree, and then you just hike the island and you look, and like there's still a sense of like you're gonna find what you find. Like it's not like I'm gonna go to this cave because I've seen a picture of it on Instagram.
Right.
And so I still get that little stoke of kind of exploring while I'm sailing, doing that. I think that's what's so special about the sailing. And you used to get that, just from backpacking 25 years ago because there was no visual. If you went to Lombok, you would probably never seen a picture from Lombok, whereas now there's like a whole bunch of Instagrammers that actually live on Lombok, and every little piece of Lombok is portrayed.
Yeah, you can do a 3D walkthrough on VR now.
Yeah, and I think it's people, if they could experience that, I think they would get out more. One of the things I've always hoped my photography might achieve is to get people out just looking at things, whether that's just a walk in the local park or going to a different country or doing a climb in the Himalayas. It doesn't really matter, but it's whatever level they're comfortable with. But it's like the trap is, and we see that right coming back to society and putting our kids back in the school, and then all the other kids at the school just obsessed with devices. Like just some of the kids at school, like they get hours and hours a day on these devices, and it's just like this is your childhood, and you're going to spend it on these devices. Like it's an interesting time we're living in because it's as humans we there's an evolutionary connection there to like actually being out and exploring, and that's one of the things that makes us human is that like if our situation was not great, we would move to another location, or would just go off yonder over the horizon looking for better circumstances. So I feel like now, whereas it's like if your circumstances aren't great, the tendency is just to either mitigate them via devices or chemicals. So it's I think that's something the society has to deal with, and it's going to be interesting as the metaverse cranks up to the next level. If it's just so much life, so much better in the metaverse, is how much time do people spend in the real world? And is that a problem, or is it just something an old photographer like me worries about?
Yeah, it's interesting to see what's happening because, a lot of people are afraid of what's happening in the world. They're afraid to leave their homes. They're afraid to travel. The metaverse just seems more appealing. It's cheaper. It's safer. Yeah, who knows where we're going? It's interesting to watch, but yeah, it's scary because I'm raising a daughter in this world, and I want to take her every single day to the park. I want to take her traveling. I mean, that's why I've shortened my photography travel experiences just because I've missed out on so much of her life growing up. So I completely resonate with what you've been saying. It's funny because me and my wife have been talking about like buying an RV and just selling our home and just traveling, the U.S. and just living out of the RV so I can keep chasing my passion. But yeah, as the world grows and as the metaverse grows and as technology continues to evolve, who knows where this generation's headed, but it's definitely interesting to watch, but I don't know if there's an answer. I don't know if there's a way to predict this.
Yeah, and I think it's also the interesting thing is like if you look at the great conservation era, at least in Australia, was in like the late 1970s, early 1980s, and um, there were a lot of old growth forests that were 10,000 years old, and that were converted to national parks and etc. in that period. And there was kind of like a wave of support for nature and these spectacular places. Um, and you look at what's going on now, and you look at Sydney, and in that period from the 70s to now, it's grown from 1 million people to 5 million people.
Hmm.
But there is less people. Like west of Sydney, is actually the world's largest temperate wilderness area that's forested, because most Mediterranean climate temperate forest is clear felled, and you grow agriculture there. Because Australia is a relatively recently developed country, it just kind of has the last of it really. But there were more people hiking in that area, like long-term multi-day hiking in the 1970s than there are now, and it's like 5 times the population, but there's less people out hiking. And that statistic kind of does my head in, because it's like if people are just content to stay at home on their devices, then they don't really connect with these great wilderness areas. And if you don't connect with the wilderness areas, then what's the point of keeping them?
Right.
And I feel like if people had that mentality in the 1970s, that would all just been logged and dammed, and that area would be gone. So it is interesting. I think we have to encourage people to get out and spend time in these areas so that they value them. Um, but I don't know how to connect. Then I think this is connecting through NFTs and digital art, and that's a way to, I guess, bridge the gap between those places and the metaverse, and then hopefully people will care about these places still in 50 years, because otherwise they'll be gone.
Yeah, it's a weird time because we're in peak comfort. We can order a meal to our house. We don't ever have to leave. You literally can have just everything accessible to your home. And so I think, yeah, a lot of people um as society evolves, I think, yeah, less and less people will probably go outside. And I'm not sure what that will do because if you don't have a connection with a world that needs protection, why would you want to protect it?
Yeah, yeah, and what's ironic is that the big companies are like the ones documenting it. Like Google has spent a lot of money um, mapping the Great Barrier Reef, and it's something that's acutely in my mind now. Is that the reefs are basically done globally. They're dying at a crazy rate, and
Yeah.
it's easy to think, oh yeah, that's just that's bullshit, whatever. But it's once you spend 4 years on the sea and you're every day swimming in it, and it's just dying. And I grew up in Queensland, just off the Great Barrier Reef, right there. I have great memories of we would. I grew up in suburbia. My dad was a counsellor at a school, so he got 6 weeks holiday a year at Christmas. And Christmas is summer for us, so we would go. camping often for the 6 weeks. And, we used to go to these remote islands where they'd get a barge and they would just drop you on this island. And the island was like a meter, 3 feet high in the middle of the island. And they would pick you up in 2 weeks. So you just had some tents and
Wow.
um, some, bunch of cool boxes. And you'd just camp on the beach for 2 weeks and then they would pick you up. This is like late 80s. So there's no kind of tourism there. And the reef was amazing. It was just like, these were like little atolls. So at low tide, the water would like drain out of the atoll. So the fringe of the reef would stick out. And then all the fish would get trapped inside the atoll and you could swim. It was kind of like Finding Nemo, like it was just. So I have those kind of foundational memories of what a reef should look like. And then, 20, 30 years later, it's just such a poor replication of what it used to be. But there's a shifting, like as people forget what it used to be like, they're like, oh, the reef's amazing. Come snorkeling here, it's amazing. And, most of the reef in the Caribbean is dead. Pretty much all the reef in the Philippines and Indonesia is dead. It's just dying everywhere. So part of the, in terms of sailing, is like I see my kids, show the reef to my kids. But anyway, what I was saying is about the corporations is, Google spent all this money filming the reef in 3D with this underwater drone technology. And of course, the companies see it first. It's a bit like Mitsubishi is freezing. They're buying up all the bluefin and freezing it, the Atlantic bluefin, because it's going to go extinct, and then they'll be able to sell, after it's extinct, the value of sashimi from extinct fish will go up, right? So they're doing like super, super cold, like minus 200 deep freezing of this bluefin because they can sell it once it's extinct and make a lot more money that way. But Google is filming the Great Barrier Reef. You can go on like Google Street View and like swim through the reef. They're doing it in like ultra high definition, so you can imagine in 20 years when the reef is, looking pretty nasty, you can put your VR goggles on and go swimming through the reef and see what it was like 20 years ago. And that's an interesting thing that they obviously have looked at that and go, oh, this is an opportunity to revenue in 50 years if we have this amazing documentation of the reef. But yeah, it's the world's changing pretty quick. There's a lot of us on this little blue dot, so.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It almost seems like it's almost incentivized for things to go extinct because there'll be more value in it.
Yeah. But there's still, that said, there's still, a lot of beautiful things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And go ahead.
So as humans, we have this ability to just adjust what normally is. It's what makes us so adaptable. But no one grieves of the great forests of England. 1,000 years ago, England was covered in forest. One of the biggest oak forests in the world, and all of that forest in Western Europe was chopped down. And you go to the Hills District in England, and it's beautiful, and you don't grieve for the forest, I guess. So it's change is always happening. But I think what is the difference now is that we only have this little disparate amount of wilderness left in these little patches in places like Alaska or Tasmania, and but they're just such little places left now that are true wilderness. I'm talking true wilderness where it might take you 20 days to hike in.
Right.
But a third of Tasmania is national park, for example, and proper wilderness. And obviously places in Alaska, and I imagine there'd be a fair bit in Russia, etc.
Yeah, Russia.
But it's really at the extremes of the world now. There's not a lot of wilderness in any kind of livable climate.
Yeah, it's interesting to see what's happening. Is there anything that you're currently working on? I know you just did the Northern Exposure expedition. All those incredibly beautiful photos. Is there any new collections you're working on, or anything you got coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of ocean work that I'm working through. So the next thing for me, I think I'm going to do some more ocean editions.
Amazing.
So I did the Intrepid Ocean, the initial series, and basically season 1 sold out, and then I did a series of 3 editions, and 69 editions each, and they all sold out within like 12 to 24 hours.
Dude, congrats. It's amazing.
Of launching. So they basically, which was in a pretty crappy market, so to get that kind of support was quite humbling. then I released the season two, which was the American work, and it basically sold out at pre-launch, um, 12 one month. And so that was, yeah, it's great. It's been great to have such long-term support as well from a lot of collectors who've been collecting me for years now. So I think, particularly in these, hasn't been the best market, I think, for a lot of artists in the space. So to have people follow along with my story has been great. And yeah, so what I want to do next is another probably three um, editions of the ocean work. So I'm not one that I find that when you're editing, if I've just been to the location, I'm kind of, I don't like editing straight away. Like it's what I like to do with my work is have some kind of emotion conveyed across from the work. So if photography, I think to me is about conveying a sense of being there and a sense of emotion in the moment. And what I find when you've just been there, so say you've just been somewhere amazing, your brain is wrapped up in the dopamine of actually having just been there. Like so, it's hard to separate the image from the experience in your own brain. But everyone else, when they view the image, they haven't been there, so they don't have that same response in their brain. So like if you've just been somewhere amazing, so you just went, and let's just say you just went to the pyramids or something, and you take photos of the pyramids and you're looking at your photos, but when you look at your photos, you're triggering that recent memory of actually being there. And so that is triggering a response in your brain that is perhaps more positive to the image than a third party observer would get just from the image because you're triggering that memory. So I like to wait a few years typically before editing, which seems a very slow workflow, but I feel like if I go back, like I just did all of that Northern Exposure work, series that I released, that was shot maybe 5 or 6 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
And I can look at it and I can look at it objectively because kind of that intense, like we had a truck camper, a four-wheel drive little truck camper. It was a Ram 3500 with a slide-on truck camper on the back that was winterized so we could camp down to minus 35. And we spent a lot of time, with the two boys in that little tiny little space. And, I would camp out looking for caribou. The central mountain caribou are kind of going extinct. They're very hard to see, but if you just camp out for days and days and days in this little truck camper at the end of a forestry road, eventually you'll see something. But obviously at the time, like that, to develop that work, all of those memories, and like I see that work and I think of even 5 years later, I think of all those memories, right? But they're not so visceral, so I can actually edit them in a way that is more objective. I'm not sure if that makes any sense to anyone else, but it just allows me, I think, to kind of then engineer a little bit more of the emotion back into the image because I'm not so just like overwhelmed with the emotion looking at it.
Right. No, I think it makes complete sense. I personally take a long time before once I take a photo to edit it because it has to sit for a while. It has to resonate. It have to, and I think jumping into editing, it's not exactly my favorite part. So I try to avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, and what I find amazing about the space now is like I released a series on Solana, the Himalayan Awakening series, and it's a series that I took on slide film 25 years ago.
Wow.
And I could I rescanned all the slides with a multi-pass, like a HDR scanner. So they scan. There's a lot of dynamic range in slides.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, when you scan them, they were quite flat because the scanners just didn't capture the dynamic range.
Yeah.
And but now you can do a multi-pass HDR scan where you scan the slide. It's like bracketing, but you're bracketing the slide.
Wow.
And then you can essentially layer the slide in Photoshop. The luminosity mask, bring back the highlights and everything. So you can take this old work that has been there for 25 years and I can work it into something that's kind of a more modern quality from a very old. I mean, that's why I was really late to digital because I was just obsessed. Like Kodachrome, as I said, I had these Nat Geos, and the 1970s Nat Geos was all shot either on Kodachrome 25 or Kodachrome 64. They're kind of grainy. It's a certain kind of color cast to Kodachrome that you didn't get from the Ektachrome emulsions. And I would shoot that, and I love that look, but with current technology, you can do this multi-pass HDR scanning, and even back then, I used to get 40 um, um, 40 megapixels um, from a drum scanner,
Oh,
and this was in 2006. And all my friends started shooting digital, and they're like, Rob, you got to come across to this, SLR digitals. And they were like 3 or 4 megapixels, these cameras.
yeah,
And
I
I'm like,
remember.
I just can't go from this beautiful billboard. Like, I take a picture and I could put it on a billboard and it would be epic.
Yeah,
And it was like going to a really bad, selfie from the front of a phone from 10 years ago. And it's like,
right.
I just couldn't do it. But then it just started getting so expensive. Like at the end of it, towards the end, it was costing almost $3 a shot. It was about $1 to get the slide, and about $1 to develop, and $1 to scan it. And so I was like, I just can't keep this up at these prices, because as the industry collapsed, the development costs became more boutique development costs. Whereas when everyone was doing it, you could buy a roll of slide film from B&H for $2.50 and get it developed pretty cheaply. But it became like a niche thing, and then the cost just blew in. But this series, I basically did these multi-pass scans, and then you can do, what I find fascinating is that the noise. This is the engineering part of my brain, but there's a lot of grain in slides, and we kind of think of grain now because most of us haven't grown up shooting film. We think of grain like noise, but it's not noise. It's actually chemical. It's a chemical pattern, and there is information in the noise in slide. So it's the grain actually holds information more so than noise on a digital camera is random static. It's basically static that the sensor is picking up. So stray signal that's coming in, either internal stray signal or external stray signal. So you can take the slide and it looks grainy, and you've got your 30 megapixels on the scan, and then you can run it through like an AI sharpening, and it can actually draw information from the grain, which I find fascinating because the grain is not random. It's actually, there's a signal in the grain. So from like a maths perspective, that's pretty fascinating because it's like the chemicals are growing in a certain way based on the light. And so the grain contains some signal that the modern AI algorithms can actually draw extra detail out of, more so than a standard noise reduction algorithm. So the quality you can get out of these slide scans is pretty phenomenal.
That's amazing. The technology is definitely allowing older archival images to be, redistributed, which is, I think, amazing for artists like us who have, been shooting for so long, because we can go back to so much older stuff. I mean, I look back at some of the work that I shot back in 2006, 2007, and it was just awful. And so I can go through AI now, and, if it was slightly soft or if there was, some errors, I can fix it now, which is, I think, amazing for me, because some of these images I can't retake.
Yeah, and I think people obsess over quality too a little bit too much. I mean, I think most of what makes the image is the composition and the color tones. There's been this kind of megapixel mania that you need more megapixels are better, but it's I had double page spreads in that Geo Traveler shot on Canon 6D2 kind of thing. So it's like, or 6D, that were like 15, 16 megapixels. So it really is about the photo, not the megapixels.
Oh, totally. I got stuff that is from my T1i that I can still blow up and shoot, or that is, can be blown up to like 60, 70 inches. Yeah, it's
So
interesting
that's
as technology advances, it definitely helps photography, but at the same time, yeah, it's a megapixel war. It's, who has the best gear. And at the end of the day, it's not about the camera. It's about the photo.
yeah, and it's certainly, I mean, it's made the ability to create a career out of it much
Yeah.
more possible, I think. What amazes me is, like, we can be on the boat with Starlink, and Starlink is, I don't think people realize how revolutionary Starlink is until they've used it, but it's the bandwidth in the sky is limited by how many people are looking at that little bit of the sky, and how many satellites there are in the sky. So the more remote you are, the faster it gets. And so it's one of those weird technologies that the further out in the wilderness you are, the faster your internet is.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting.
but when we got back to Australia, one of the things when my middle son, he was 10, he's like, Dad, when can we go back to the boat to get the fast internet? And it's like such a weird thing to think of is that when can we go back somewhere really remote so that we own the whole sky? Like the 3 square miles of sky you can see above you. Like if you're the only person in that 3 square miles, you'll get like 400 megabits, 500 megabits from Starlink because you're the only one using it. Whereas when you're in society and there's 50 people looking at that bit of sky, you've got to share the bandwidth with them. So um, yeah, no, it is a strange world. But the fact that you can be on a boat in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the ocean, and you can be doing a live stream on X
It's pretty amazing.
while you're out there, it's just
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Well, you have lived an incredibly adventurous life, and I have to say it's a really beautiful story. I have enjoyed listening to everything that you've done. It's quite fascinating. For anyone who is listening that doesn't know you or has never seen your work before, where's the best place for them to find your stuff?
look, I think just the pen tweet
Okay.
on X.
And what's your X username?
Intrepid with an underscore P.
Okay. Right. And then you have a website too, right?
Intrepid.art is my website.
Okay.
And Deca has, if you want to look at like the sales history, Deca has probably the best cross-platform sales history.
Is that deca.art?
Yeah, Deca.art/Intrepid.
Beautiful. Um,
Yeah.
well, I don't want to keep you here too much longer. We've been here 2 hours. I want to thank you so much for your time. I know you got stuff to do. Anything else going on that you've got coming up in Web3?
Look, no, I guess just this series of editions coming out soon, and trying not to FOMO too much about everyone being in Marfa this week.
I get that.
I went last year, and one of the nice things about being able to sail the 6 month sailing in the States was that last year, got to spend all the time in New York, and then also went to Art Basel, Miami, and down to Marfa. So it was good to actually connect one-on-one with a lot of the people I had been connecting with online for years. So
Totally.
that was pretty nice. But yeah, no, I think Web3, the art is just survival, really. I'm a photographer whether Web3 exists or not. Like it's in my bones. I adventure. I take photos. If people like them, great. If they don't, it's not going to change what I'm doing. So
I get that.
it's more of an observational. It's great to have people follow along the journey and support my work, and that allows me to keep doing it. So it's it's a real appreciation for the people that put that patronage in. But Web3 with the provenance allows people to do that and have a little bit of ownership in the story as well, which I think is wonderful.
Well, keep shooting, man. I can't wait to see your next collection. And dude, thank you so much for your time.
John, I really appreciate you having me on the pod, and been following your journey since the start of Web3 as well. So it's been great to connect.
No, thanks, man. I've always wanted to hear the background of all your work. I see that you sail around, but I needed to hear the background of everything, and it is just as cool as I thought it was. So, dude, thank you for your time.
No, thank you.